The dust swirled in lazy circles around the broken-down wagon, and Mary Catherine wiped her tear-stained cheeks with the back of her calloused hand. Her mother lay still in the wagon bed, breathing in shallow, labored gasps that seemed to grow weaker with each passing hour. The fever had taken hold 3 days ago, and now her once vibrant face was pale as winter snow, her lips cracked and dry despite Mary Catherine's desperate attempts to give her water from their dwindling supply. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of golden grass under the merciless August sun. Their horse had collapsed that morning, finally succumbing to exhaustion after pulling the overloaded wagon for weeks across the unforgiving terrain. Mary Catherine had watched helplessly as the faithful animal drew its last breath, leaving them stranded miles from anywhere, with no help in sight and precious little hope remaining. She was only 19, but the hardships of frontier life had aged her beyond her years. Her hands were rough from work, her face bronzed by the sun, and her once bright blue dress was now faded and patched. She had known struggle before, but nothing like this. Nothing that threatened to take away the only family she had left in this harsh, unforgiving world. Her father had died 2 winters ago when a blizzard caught him checking on their cattle. Her younger brother had succumbed to pneumonia the following spring. Now it was just her and her mother, and they had been traveling west in search of her uncle's ranch in Colorado, hoping for a fresh start and a chance to rebuild their shattered lives. But fate seemed determined to test them at every turn. Mary Catherine knelt beside the wagon and took her mother's fevered hand in both of hers. "Mama," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please don't leave me. I don't know what to do without you." Her mother's eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused and glassy, before closing again. The silence that followed was broken only by the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The heat was unbearable, and Mary Catherine could feel her strength slipping away with each passing hour. She had done everything she could, placing cool cloths on her mother's forehead, using their precious water, speaking softly to comfort her. But nothing seemed to help. The broken wagon wheel told the story of their final misfortune. The iron rim had shattered beyond repair when it struck a hidden rock during their desperate escape from the storm 3 nights ago. They had been living on hardtack and dried beans for the past week, their supplies running dangerously low as they pushed westward through the endless grassland. Mary Catherine's stomach cramped with hunger, but she couldn't bring herself to eat while her mother lay dying. Instead, she sat in the meager shade of the wagon, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of help that she knew in her heart would never come. The vastness of the prairie seemed to mock their small tragedy. What were 2 women and a broken wagon against such immensity? They were like drops of water in an ocean, insignificant and easily forgotten. Mary Catherine thought of all the dreams they had shared during the long journey, all the plans for their new life in Colorado, where her uncle supposedly had a thriving ranch and a place for them to start over. Now those dreams seemed as distant as the mountains they would never reach. She pulled her mother's quilt higher, even though the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. The fabric was one of the few things they had managed to save from their old life, hand-stitched by her grandmother with patterns that told the story of 3 generations of women who had faced hardship with dignity and courage. Mary Catherine wondered if she had that same courage now, when it mattered most. She felt so young and unprepared for the responsibility of caring for her dying mother in the middle of nowhere. Every decision seemed impossible. Every moment brought fresh despair. Should she try to walk for help, leaving her mother alone and defenseless? Should she stay and watch helplessly as the fever consumed the last person she had left in the world? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Mary Catherine first heard the sound of hoofbeats. She looked up, shading her eyes against the glare, and saw a lone rider approaching across the prairie. Her heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. In this wild country, a stranger could mean salvation or danger, and she had no way of knowing which until it was too late to run. The rider drew closer, and she could see that he was a tall man on a sturdy bay horse, wearing the practical clothes of a working cowboy. His hat was pulled low over his face, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble. He slowed his horse as he approached, and Mary Catherine instinctively moved closer to the wagon, positioning herself between the stranger and her helpless mother. She had heard too many stories of what could happen to defenseless women on the frontier, tales of outlaws and drifters who preyed on the vulnerable. Her father's old rifle lay somewhere in the jumbled contents of their wagon, but she had never been much good with firearms, and in her current state of exhaustion, she doubted she could even lift it properly. The cowboy dismounted about 20 feet away, his movements slow and deliberate, clearly trying not to frighten her. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with weathered features that spoke of years spent under the open sky. His clothes were dusty but well maintained, and she noticed the way he kept his hands visible and away from the gun on his hip. "Mom," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. His voice was deep and gentle, with the slight drawl of a man raised in Texas. "I couldn't help but notice you might be in some trouble here. Is there anything I can do to help?" There was something in his manner that spoke of genuine concern rather than opportunism. His eyes, she noticed, were a warm brown color, and they held none of the calculating hardness she had learned to fear in some men. Still, years of frontier living had taught her caution, and she found herself studying his face for signs of deception or ill intent. Mary Catherine's throat was so tight with emotion that she could barely speak. "My mother," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's very sick and our horse died. I don't know what to do." The words came out in a rush, followed by a fresh wave of tears that she tried unsuccessfully to hold back. She hated showing weakness in front of a stranger, but her reserves of strength were completely depleted. The cowboy's expression softened with genuine concern, and she could see something in his face that reminded her of her father, a basic decency that couldn't be faked. "May I take a look at her?" he asked. "I've had some experience with fever and such. My name's Jake Sullivan, by the way. I work for the Double R Ranch about 15 miles south of here." The mention of his name and employment gave Mary Catherine a small measure of comfort. Drifters and outlaws rarely volunteered such information, and his willingness to identify himself suggested honest intentions. She nodded, too exhausted and desperate to refuse help from anyone willing to offer it. She watched as Jake approached the wagon with careful, respectful steps. He removed his hat before looking down at her mother, and she noticed that his hair was dark brown with threads of premature gray at the temples. There was something reverent in the way he looked at the sick woman, as if he understood the sacred nature of human suffering and the responsibility that came with witnessing it. Jake placed the back of his hand gently against her mother's forehead, then checked her pulse with practiced ease. His touch was careful and professional, and Mary Catherine found herself wondering where a cowboy had learned such skills. His face was grave as he turned back to Mary Catherine, and she braced herself for the worst. "She's burning up with fever, and she's severely dehydrated," he said quietly. "How long has she been like this?" 3 days, Mary Catherine replied, wrapping her arms around herself despite the heat. "Maybe 4, it's hard to remember. She was fine when we left Kansas, but the journey has been so hard, and we ran low on food and clean water." She looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Is she going to die?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the sick woman with thoughtful eyes. When he spoke, his voice was honest but not without hope. "I won't lie to you, miss. She's in bad shape, but I've seen folks pull through worse than this, given proper care and medicine. The problem is, she needs help that you can't give her out here in the middle of nowhere." Mary Catherine felt her knees go weak, and she sank down onto a nearby rock. The confirmation of what she already knew in her heart was almost more than she could bear. "There's nowhere to go," she said hopelessly. "We were trying to reach my uncle's ranch in Colorado, but I don't even know how far we still have to travel. We don't have any money left, and now we don't even have a horse." The weight of their situation pressed down on her like a physical burden. They were hundreds of miles from anywhere, with no resources and no way to continue their journey. Even if her mother survived the fever, what future awaited them? They would be trapped on the prairie with no means of support and winter approaching in a few short months. Jake knelt down in front of her, his eyes kind but serious. The gesture brought him to her eye level, and she could see the compassion in his weathered face. "Listen to me, miss. I know we're strangers, but I can't in good conscience ride away and leave you two out here. My boss's wife, Mrs. Reynolds, she's got medical training from back east. Used to be a nurse before she married into ranching. If I can get your mother to the ranch, she might be able to help." Mary Catherine looked up at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The offer seemed too good to be true, and her experience had taught her to be wary of men who made grand promises to vulnerable women. "Why would you do that for us?" You don't even know us." Jake stood up and gazed out across the prairie for a moment before answering. When he looked back at her, his expression was thoughtful and sincere. "I reckon that's exactly why I should help. Out here, we're all just trying to survive and make something of ourselves. When someone's in trouble, you lend a hand if you can. It's the only way any of us make it through." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Besides, my mother raised me to be a gentleman. She'd box my ears if she knew I'd ridden past a lady in distress." The mention of his mother brought fresh tears to Mary Catherine's eyes, but they were different tears now, touched with the first hint of hope she had felt in days. "I don't know how we could ever repay you," she said. "We don't have anything left to give." "I'm not asking for repayment," Jake replied firmly, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who meant every word. "But I am asking you to trust me. I know it's not easy to put your faith in a stranger, but your mother doesn't have much time. We need to get her to the ranch as soon as possible." Mary Catherine looked at her mother's still form in the wagon, then back at Jake's honest face. Something in his manner, in the straightforward way he met her eyes, convinced her that this was a man who could be trusted. Every instinct told her to accept his help, that this might be the miracle she had been praying for in her darkest moments. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice stronger now despite her exhaustion. Jake was already moving toward his horse with purposeful strides. "I'm going to ride hard back to the ranch and bring back a wagon with a proper team. Mrs. Reynolds will want to come along too, I suspect, and she'll know what medicines to bring. It'll take me a few hours to get there and back, but I'll push as hard as I can." He paused and looked back at her with concern. "Will you be all right here alone?" Mary Catherine nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. The thought of being alone on the prairie as darkness approached was terrifying, but she knew Jake was right about the urgency of their situation. "We'll be fine. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I don't know why you're doing this for us, but thank you." Jake swung up into his saddle with practiced ease, his movements fluid despite his obvious haste. "Just Jake will do fine, miss. And you haven't told me your name yet." "Mary Catherine Porter," she replied, standing up straighter as she spoke. "And that's my mother, Elizabeth." Jake touched his hat brim again in that respectful gesture she was beginning to associate with him. "I'll be back as soon as I can, Miss Porter. Keep her as cool as you can and try to get some water into her if she'll take it. Don't lose hope, Mrs. Reynolds has saved folks who were worse off than your mother." With that encouraging words, he spurred his horse into a gallop and disappeared across the prairie, leaving behind only a cloud of dust and the first real hope Mary Catherine had felt in days. The hours that followed were the longest of Mary Catherine's life. She did her best to follow Jake's advice, using their remaining water to dampen a cloth and cool her mother's fevered brow. She talked to her unconscious mother, telling her about the kind cowboy who had promised to help them, and sharing memories of better times when their family was whole and the future seemed bright with possibility. As the shadows grew longer and the prairie began to cool, Mary Catherine found herself thinking about Jake Sullivan and the unexpected kindness he had shown them. In a world where most people looked out only for themselves, his willingness to help complete strangers seemed almost miraculous. She wondered about his past, about what had shaped him into the kind of man who would risk his own time and energy to save people he had never met before. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky when she heard the distant rumble of wagon wheels and multiple horses. Her heart leaped with relief and anticipation as the sounds grew closer. Soon she could make out the shapes of two wagons approaching across the prairie, one driven by Jake and the other by someone she couldn't yet identify. As the wagons came to a stop near their broken-down vehicle, Mary Catherine saw that Jake had brought not just help, but what appeared to be a small rescue party. The second wagon was driven by an older man with a gray beard, and beside him sat a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. The woman immediately climbed down from the wagon and hurried over to where Mary Catherine waited. Her movements were brisk and confident, and she carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "You must be Mary Catherine," she said warmly, taking the younger woman's hands in hers. "I'm Margaret Reynolds. Jake told us about your mother, and I've brought everything I think we might need to help her." Mary Catherine felt tears of relief streaming down her cheeks as she looked into Margaret Reynolds's compassionate face. Here was someone who clearly knew what she was doing, someone with the knowledge and experience that might save her mother's life. "Thank you for coming," she managed to say through her tears. "I've been so frightened." Margaret squeezed her hands reassuringly before moving with quick efficiency to examine Elizabeth. Her touch was gentle, but sure as she checked the sick woman's pulse and breathing. And Mary Catherine watched anxiously as the older woman opened a small medical bag and pulled out various bottles and instruments that looked foreign and promising. "She's very sick," Mrs. Reynolds said softly after her initial examination, "but I've seen this kind of fever before. The key is getting her temperature down and replacing the fluids she's lost. With proper care and the right medicines, she has a fighting chance." Jake and the older man, who introduced himself as Tom Reynolds, Margaret's husband and owner of the Double R Ranch, carefully transferred Elizabeth to the back of their wagon, which had been fitted with a comfortable mattress and clean blankets. Mary Catherine watched in amazement as these kind strangers worked together with practiced efficiency to help someone they had never met, asking nothing in return but the chance to do good in a harsh world. Mary Catherine gathered their few remaining possessions, her heart lighter than it had been in days as she watched these kind strangers work to save her mother's life. Tom Reynolds helped her into the back of the wagon beside her mother, while Margaret climbed up to tend to Elizabeth during the journey. Jake mounted his horse and rode alongside them, occasionally calling out directions to his boss as they navigated the darkening prairie. The journey to the Double R Ranch took 2 hours through the gathering darkness, with Margaret Reynolds working steadily to cool Elizabeth's fever and get small amounts of water into her unconscious patient. Mary Catherine held her mother's hand and prayed silently, hardly daring to believe that help had finally arrived when all seemed lost. The ranch house was a large, comfortable structure built of local stone and timber, with wide porches and glowing windows that spoke of warmth and hospitality. Tom Reynolds drove the wagon right up to the front door, where several ranch hands were waiting to help carry Elizabeth inside. Margaret Reynolds had clearly sent word ahead about their arrival, because a room had already been prepared with clean sheets and everything needed for a sick room. The next few days passed in a blur of worry and hope. Mary Catherine rarely left her mother's side, sleeping in a chair beside the bed and helping Margaret Reynolds with the constant care that Elizabeth required. The older woman proved to be as skilled as Jake had promised, administering medicines and treatments with the confidence of someone who had dealt with frontier illness many times before. Margaret showed Mary Catherine how to properly cool a fever, how to recognize the signs of improvement or decline, and how to encourage a patient to take fluids even when unconscious. She spoke to Mary Catherine as an equal, sharing her knowledge freely and treating her not as a charity case, but as a partner in her mother's care. "Sometimes," Margaret said one evening as they worked together to change Elizabeth's bedding, "the sound of a loved one's voice can reach through even the deepest unconsciousness. Don't stop talking to her, telling her you're here, and that she needs to fight to get better." Jake visited the sick room several times each day, always removing his hat respectfully and speaking in quiet tones so as not to disturb the patient. He brought fresh flowers from the meadow behind the ranch house, saying they might help brighten the room and lift Mary Catherine's spirits. He also brought news from the outside world, telling her about the daily life of the ranch and the preparations being made for the coming autumn roundup. More than once, Mary Catherine caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something warm and gentle that made her heart flutter, despite her worry about her mother. There was a steadiness about Jake that she found deeply comforting, a sense that here was a man who could be counted on when things got difficult. On the third night, as Mary Catherine dozed fitfully in her chair, she was awakened by a change in her mother's breathing. Elizabeth's labored gasps had given way to deeper, more regular breaths, and when Mary Catherine touched her forehead, she found that the fever had broken at last. She called out softly for Margaret, who came hurrying into the room with a lamp. Margaret's face broke into a wide smile as she examined her patient. "The fever's broken," she confirmed. "She's not out of danger yet, but this is exactly what we've been hoping for. Her body is finally winning the fight." Mary Catherine felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she took her mother's cool hand in both of hers. For the first time in nearly a week, Elizabeth's skin felt normal to the touch, and her breathing was strong and steady. "Mama," she whispered, "you're going to be all right. You're going to be all right." On the fourth day, Elizabeth's eyes opened for the first time since her fever broke. Mary Catherine was sitting beside the bed, reading aloud from a book of poetry that Margaret had lent her, when she heard her mother's weak voice calling her name. She looked up to find Elizabeth's eyes open and clear, focused on her daughter's face with recognition and love. "Where are we?" Elizabeth asked weakly, looking around the unfamiliar room with confusion. Mary Catherine took her mother's hand and explained everything that had happened, from their breakdown on the prairie to Jake's rescue and the kindness of the Reynolds family. Elizabeth listened with growing amazement, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she realized how close she had come to leaving her daughter alone in the world. "I remember being so hot," Elizabeth said softly, "and feeling like I was drifting away from everything. But I could hear your voice calling me back. I knew I had to fight to stay with you." Margaret Reynolds came hurrying into the room when she heard the voices, and her face lit up with satisfaction when she saw her patient sitting up and talking. "Welcome back to the world of the living, Elizabeth," she said warmly. "You gave us quite a scare, but I think you're going to be just fine now." Word of Elizabeth's recovery spread quickly through the ranch house, and within minutes, Tom Reynolds and Jake appeared in the doorway to offer their congratulations. Jake's relief was written plainly across his face, and when he met Mary Catherine's eyes, she saw something there that made her cheeks flush with warmth. "I can't thank you enough," Elizabeth said to the assembled group, her voice still weak but filled with emotion. "All of you, you saved my life, and I'll never forget your kindness." Tom Reynolds waved away her thanks with characteristic modesty. "We just did what any decent folks would do," he said. "The question now is what you ladies plan to do next. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to recover your strength." Mary Catherine had been dreading this moment, knowing that they would eventually have to face the reality of their situation. They had lost everything except the clothes on their backs and had no means of continuing their journey to Colorado. She was about to explain their dire circumstances when Jake spoke up from his position near the door. "If I may," he said, his voice slightly formal, "I'd like to make a suggestion." He looked directly at Mary Catherine as he continued. "We're always in need of good help here on the ranch. Tom's been talking about needing someone to help Margaret with the house and the cooking for the hands. And we could use another person to help with the horses and cattle work, someone who's not afraid of hard work." Mary Catherine felt her heart skip a beat at the implication of his words. "Are you offering us jobs?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. Tom Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Jake's right. We could use the help, and you two seem like the kind of people we'd be proud to have working with us. The pay isn't fancy, but it's honest work, and you'd have a place to live and 3 meals a day." Elizabeth struggled to sit up straighter in bed, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. "We would be honored to work for you," she said. "We're not afraid of hard work, and we'll do whatever needs to be done." Over the following weeks, as Elizabeth continued to recover her strength, Mary Catherine threw herself into learning the routines of ranch life. She helped Margaret with cooking and cleaning, tended the vegetable garden that supplied fresh produce for the ranch hands' meals, and even learned to assist with caring for the cattle and horses. The work was hard, but it was honest and fulfilling in a way that her previous life had never been. Jake became her patient teacher in the ways of ranch work, showing her how to handle horses, rope cattle, and perform the dozens of tasks that kept a working ranch running smoothly. As they worked together, their initial formal politeness gradually gave way to easy conversation and shared laughter. Mary Catherine found herself looking forward to their daily interactions, and she began to notice the way Jake's eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. She learned that Jake had grown up on a ranch in Texas, the youngest son of a family that had lost everything in the aftermath of the Civil War. He had come north looking for work and opportunity, eventually finding both at the Double R Ranch. Tom Reynolds had taken him on as a green kid and taught him everything about running cattle and managing horses. Over the years, Jake had proven himself to be not just a skilled cowboy, but a natural leader whom the other hands respected and followed. There was a quiet strength about Jake that Mary Catherine found deeply attractive. He never boasted about his abilities or tried to impress her with stories of his adventures. Instead, he let his actions speak for themselves, showing her through his daily behavior that he was a man who could be trusted with important responsibilities. One evening in late September, as the first hints of autumn began to paint the leaves on the cottonwood trees. Jake asked Mary Catherine to walk with him down to the creek that ran behind the ranch house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the meadow, and the air was crisp with the promise of changing seasons. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the gentle murmur of the water and the distant lowing of cattle settling down for the night. Mary Catherine had come to treasure these quiet moments with Jake, when the demands of ranch life fell away and they could simply enjoy each other's company. Finally, Jake stopped beside a large boulder and turned to face her, his expression serious but warm. He removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. "Mary Catherine," he began, then stopped and took a deep breath. "I hope you won't think I'm speaking out of turn, but I need to tell you something." Mary Catherine felt her heart begin to race, sensing that this conversation would change everything between them. "What is it, Jake?" she asked softly. He looked down at his hat for a moment, then met her eyes with steady determination. "These past few weeks getting to know you and your mother, working alongside you every day, I've come to realize something. You're the finest woman I've ever known, Mary Catherine. You're strong and brave and kind, and you face whatever life throws at you with more courage than most men I know." Mary Catherine felt tears prick at her eyes, but she remained silent, sensing that he had more to say. Jake stepped closer to her, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes. "I know we haven't known each other very long, and I know you came here under difficult circumstances, but I can't imagine this place without you anymore. I can't imagine my life without you in it." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm asking if you might consider staying here permanently, not just as a hired hand, but as my wife, if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, and Mary Catherine felt as though the world had suddenly become very quiet. She looked at this good man who had literally saved her mother's life and given them both a second chance at happiness, and she knew that her answer had been growing in her heart for weeks. "Jake," she said, reaching out to touch his weathered hand. "When you found us that day on the prairie, I thought my world was ending. I thought I was going to lose everything that mattered to me. But you didn't just save my mother's life that day. You saved mine too, in ways you might not even understand." She stepped closer to him, looking up into his honest face. "I would be honored to be your wife, Jake Sullivan. I can't think of anything that would make me happier than building a life here with you." Jake's face lit up with joy, and he swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed with pure happiness. When he set her down, he cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her softly, sealing their promise to each other under the star-filled sky. Their wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a perfect October day when the leaves were brilliant gold and red, and the air was crisp and clean. Elizabeth, now fully recovered and glowing with health and happiness, stood proudly beside her daughter as Jake's best man, Tom Reynolds, handed him the ring. Margaret Reynolds had insisted on making Mary Catherine's wedding dress, a beautiful creation of white cotton and delicate lace that made her look radiant. The entire community turned out for the celebration, including neighboring ranchers and their families, the ranch hands who had become like brothers to Jake, and even the minister who had ridden 20 miles from the nearest town to perform the ceremony. As Mary Catherine and Jake exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring, there wasn't a dry eye among the assembled guests. The reception was held in the ranch house, with tables laden with food prepared by the women of the community and music provided by Old Pete, one of the ranch hands who played fiddle with surprising skill. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued under the stars, Mary Catherine found herself standing on the porch with her new husband, looking out over the land that was now her home. "Do you ever think about that day when you found us?" she asked, leaning against Jake's strong shoulder. Jake wrapped his arms around her, holding her close against the cool night air. "Every day," he replied. "I think about how different things might have been if I'd taken a different trail that morning, or if I'd been in too much of a hurry to stop. It makes me believe that some things are just meant to be." Mary Catherine turned in his arms to look at him, her eyes shining with love and contentment. "I used to feel like everything was falling apart," she said. "When Papa and little Samuel left us, and then Mama got so sick, I thought maybe fate was angry with us. But now it feels like maybe all of that was just preparing us for this moment. For you. For this new life. Jake kissed her forehead tenderly. Whatever brought us together, I'm grateful for every moment of it, even the hard parts, because they led us here. As the years passed, Mary Catherine and Jake built a life together that was rich in love, hard work, and shared dreams. Elizabeth lived with them until her peaceful death many years later, surrounded by her daughter, son-in-law, and the grandchildren who brought her such joy. The ranch prospered under Jake's capable management and Mary Catherine's tireless support, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. They faced challenges, as all frontier families did. There were harsh winters that tested their endurance, droughts that threatened their livelihood, and the constant uncertainties of life in an untamed land. But they met each difficulty together, drawing strength from their love for each other and their faith in the future they were building. Mary Catherine often thought back to that terrible day when she had sat crying beside her sick mother, feeling utterly alone and abandoned in the vast wilderness. She remembered the despair that had threatened to overwhelm her and the miracle of Jake's appearance when all hope seemed lost. It reminded her that even in the darkest moments, help could come from unexpected places, and that the kindness of strangers could change the course of a life forever. Their story became part of the folklore of the territory, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables as an example of how ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they opened their hearts to those in need. Children grew up hearing about the cowboy who stopped to help two desperate women, and the love story that grew from that simple act of kindness. Years later, when Mary Catherine was an old woman with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, she would sit on her porch in the evening and watch the sun set over the land she had come to love so deeply. She would think about the journey that had brought her to this place, from the desperate girl crying beside a broken wagon to the matriarch of a large and loving family. The prairie that had once seemed so empty and threatening had become home, filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the movement of cattle and horses, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. She had learned that home wasn't just a place on a map, but rather the people who choose to love and support each other through whatever life might bring. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the grass rustled in the evening breeze, she could almost hear the echo of hoofbeats across the prairie, reminding her of the day when a stranger's kindness had saved not just her mother's life, but her own future as well. It was a reminder that in this harsh but beautiful land, hope could appear when least expected, and love could grow from the smallest acts of human decency and compassion.